from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Over the past number of weeks, we have been bringing you a special series titled Journey Through 20th Century America. In order to bring you that series, we were relying upon the lecture series at North Idaho College and grants that we received from the Idaho Humanities Council, from the Associated Students of North Idaho College, and seed money we've had for some time from the North Idaho College Foundation. We're grateful to all those organizations for the money that brought that symposium to our college and also these programs. We'll be concluding that journey through 20th century America today with our final special guest from history. We welcome here in the year 2000 a person from the past, Ms. Bessie Coleman, who lived from 1892 until 1926. She was the first black woman aviator. Ms. Coleman, welcome to the program. Thank you for coming from the past to be with us today and to share your life with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our two regular panelists, Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And Janelle will commence the question with our famous guest.
Bessie Coleman, you were a female aviator. Now, airplanes were a relatively new thing in your time. Can you tell us how you got interested in airplanes and what kind of training you would have initially?
Oh, certainly. I got interested in planes because they would be flying over the fields when we were out picking cotton. And then when I went to Langston College in 1910, I heard about Raymond Delaroche, who was the first woman ever licensed in the entire world. She was licensed in France. And then in 1911, Harriet Quimby became the first American woman to get her international pilot's license. She unfortunately crashed to her death in 1912, but that made me even more determined to do it. And then being a black woman, I was very, very thrilled when Eugene Bullard, who was a black American, went to France and got his pilot's license.
So where was home for you? Where were you born? Where did you live?
I was born in Atlanta, Texas, and we stayed there till I was about 2 or 3 years old, and then we moved to a small town called Waxahachie, Texas. We lived in the black section of town and went to the local school. You had to walk about 4 miles to get to school. After school, you typically had to go out into the cotton fields and pick cotton. And believe me, I hated picking cotton. But I was very, very good at math, so I made sure that the farmers never cheated us on our wages. And so that really helped out my family. We stayed there basically until I went away to college. My mother was able to pay for my first year, and then unfortunately I did have to go back home because she couldn't afford to pay anymore.
But then you got your aviation training after that.
Well, not quite. A little bit more things happened. It took me 3 years to save up money. My brothers had both gone off to World War I to fight in the war. When they came back, they went to Chicago. And I had finally written my brother Walter and just begged him to let me come to Chicago. He finally wrote a letter and said that I could come up. And I talked my mother into it. She was not very happy with me, but she knew that I was determined to become an aviator. So when I got to Chicago, my brother said, well, you can go and clean houses for the white people in the neighborhood. And I'm just, no, I could do that in Texas. I want to become an aviator. So I ended up looking for a job. I became a manicurist. And then later on, I opened up a chili parlor. In the meantime, I had met Robert Abbott, who was the founder of the Chicago Defender, which was the premier black newspaper in the United States. He was a self-made multimillionaire. I mentioned to him that I wanted to become an aviator, and he started looking around for me. Most of the schools would not take women, and they certainly would not take blacks. And so he did a little bit more research, and he said, you have to go to France. And he said, but for you to do that, you have to learn French. And so that's what I did. I went to the Berlitz School every night and got my French up to speed. And then finally, with the help of him and Jesse Binga, who owned Binga State Bank, I was able to leave for France in November of 1920. And that's when I started my flying lessons. And I got licensed on June 15th of 1921.
That's wonderful.
Steve Sheen.
Ms. Coleman, tell us a little bit about what it was like to fly airplanes in your era of aviation.
Well, it was dangerous. The first school that I applied to in France, 2 women had crashed the month before, and so they decided that women shouldn't be flying. The very, very first week I was at school, one of my fellow classmates crashed, and I was very, very shaken by it, but I didn't lose my nerve. I went on through with it, and it was fun because you had to be able to do figure eights and loop the loops and fly over the field and know how to land with the engine turned off.
These were biplanes that you were flying?
Yes.
Single-engine biplanes in your era?
Yes. What I flew typically was a JN4 or a Jenny, and they were basically wooden planes with skin. You as a pilot needed to walk around and look at things. Crashes were very, very common in those days. It was a very dangerous thing to be doing.
Now, you've mentioned France several times.
Yes.
I get the feeling that France must have been the center of aviation
Yes,
in the
they were.
20s.
They certainly were. The authority that gave me my license was the FAI, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. They were the only group that were able to give out international pilot's license in that era. The French loved flying, and I think that had a lot to do with World War I happening in their region, and they really encouraged pilots.
And tell me a little bit more about the opportunities that were going to be available to you. I mean, this is a dream of yours since you were a young girl in Texas. You take your first flight in 1921. You become a licensed pilot. What can you do with that?
Well, what started back in the United States was barnstorming. And also, you would go and you'd do air shows. And you would also charge people for flights. So in those days, you charged somebody $5 to go up in the airplane. That was a lot of money. And you could actually make $1,000 in one show, and which was very good money in the 20s. It's something that you really enjoyed. So what happened when I left France, I stayed there for 2 more months after I got my license, training with a French war ace. And then actually a little bit longer than that. In September, I came back to New York, and I started giving professional talks and encouraging people of my race to go into aviation, because I felt that only by flying could you truly be free. But at that point, there were now a lot more pilots. So barnstorming and stunt piloting was the way to go. So I went back to France for more training and flew in Germany and Switzerland and Holland. I got to fly the Dornier seaplane, which was the first commercial aircraft. It actually held 72 passengers.
Now, did you say seaplane is an SEA, water? Sea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You took off and landed on the ocean?
Yes, it did.
I see.
And it was just fascinating. That was the largest plane that any woman had ever flown up until that point in time.
Was that also a single-engine plane?
No, that was not. That was quite a bit larger. I think it was a dual-engine plane.
I see.
I had a lot of photographers actually doing film clips and whatnot. So armed with that, I was able to come back to the United States and start doing more lecture tours and more stunt piloting. I tried to talk my sister Eloise into jumping one day, and at the last minute she backed out, so I had to do the jump. And so that's how you made your money.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You articulate so well your life and all the things you did, and you certainly, with that, you are producing many questions in our mind. Once you returned to the United States, and you, in answering Steve's questions, you were involved in aviation in different ways, and very significantly pioneered in some areas. On this whole series we've been having, Journey Through 20th Century America, most of our guests have been that. That's why they've been honored on our program and pioneering and blazing new trails. My question, based on that comment, is that your life in this country and some of the things that you'd gone through, and you went to France and became a pilot, in addition to going to France because they loved flying, and also they would license you internationally, was it easier for you as the first black woman to do your aviation work in France rather than the United States? In comparing the two, was there a difference in your time?
Definitely. The French people did not have the stigma related to blacks that Americans did. In France, I was welcomed everywhere. There were no limitations on where I could go or what I could do. Coming back to the States, a lot of the problems I ran into is even though I was famous, a lot of times, like the Orlando Flower Show, they wanted me to perform, but they would not admit any blacks into the stands. And so I refused to fly for them. And that was a very big difference. A lot of times I would have to demand that they allow blacks to come in through the same door, the same gate as the whites. And they would do that, but they would still force them to sit in a separate area. And that was a very, very big difference. In my time, a lot of black Americans were becoming expatriates, such as my friend Josephine Baker. She and I used to go through all the speakeasies when I lived in Chicago, because in the United States, not only were women not allowed in bars, blacks were not allowed in bars. But the gangsters, such as Al Capone, didn't care if we came to their bars. They loved it because that generated more money for them. And so that's where most of your wealthy blacks and your fun-loving blacks went, were to all of the sort of infamous bars and whatnots and speakeasies. So that was a very, very big difference. And in France, you didn't have to put up with that.
The other issue that I would bring up, too, is that you were also not only pioneering in an area based on your race and color, but also women were not known in aviation so much. Also, again, did you find France more eager to train women as pilots than in the United States at the time that you lived?
At that time, definitely. They were much more inclined to welcome someone like myself who had very little money. The other women, American women of my time, such as Amelia Earhart, they had money. Their mothers and fathers could go out and buy them the planes, and they could be trained by their uncle or their brother or whoever. I didn't have that option. My mother was a laundress. She had no money to give me. And so they welcomed basically a almost penniless black woman into their midst, even though I was being sponsored by Jesse Binga and Robert Abbott.
One final question before I go back to the panel.
Okay.
After this great success and fame you had, would you agree that when you came back to the United States and you were having these wonderful successes in the field of aviation, that you were helping bring down certain barriers?
Most certainly. I wanted to encourage every woman and every person of color to come into aviation, because I really, truly believe that only by flying can you be free. When you looked at India, where you had 4 million people, there was one aviator, and that was a man. You had no one of color really trying to get into the field of aviation, and I really wanted to encourage all people to do that. Towards the end of my career, before my fateful death, I was going to elementary schools. I was encouraging children to get into aviation. I wanted to make a difference.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
I want to talk some more about the barnstorming because it's fascinating. What was it like, and what kinds of events did they actually have in a barnstorming show?
The types of events you would have, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the wing walkers.
And wing walking must have been pretty exciting. Did you do some wing walking?
Not as often as some of my contemporaries, but I did actually do that, and I parachuted a lot.
And parachuting probably, too, was pretty elementary, wasn't it, Bessie?
It was easier than some things. For me, the thrill was actually in the flying, because a lot of my shows, what I would do is I'd circle the field to make sure that the crowd was watching, and then I would go straight up to stall the engine. And then you're going into a nosedive, and so of course the crowd thinks you're about to crash. At the last minute, I would pull the nose up so that the air would start the propeller again, and then swing around and come back and land in safely. And that always thrilled people.
Now, what kind of speeds were you traveling at in those days? Today, airplanes travel pretty fast, but in Bessie Coleman, in your time, what speeds would you have been traveling at?
About 80 to 100 knots.
So you were not going nearly as fast as we're going today.
Not even close.
And many of your planes were probably open cockpits, weren't they?
All of them were open cockpits in those days. There really was no protection. If you weren't wearing your seatbelt, you basically, had no other protection. We did wear our helmets and whatnot, but it was a very risky business.
Now, tell me something about your uniform. You're wearing a very interesting uniform today. You weren't a military pilot.
No, I was not. Typically, when I was simply test flying, I would be in just a typical flight suit, which I'm sure you all still have today. But in order to wow the crowds, I always loved to dress. As you notice, I have my earrings and my brooch and a typical woman's blouse on. But I also had the silk scarves. I would have 4 or 5 of these with me and give those to the crowds because they loved them. And I always liked the French military uniforms. Where I went to school in France for flying school was not far from where Joan of Arc did her final battle. And I'd have to walk past that every day. And so I tended to really relate to that, and I considered myself sort of a black Joan of Arc. And so I took on the French military uniform.
Ms. Coleman, I'm amazed as I look at some of my notes. You were 19 when you left your brother's home in Chicago and went to Paris, made your way to Paris on your own, by yourself. You didn't have a traveling companion. Just learned to speak French and learned to fly. Tell me a little bit more about, you mentioned several times that the only time you're really free is when you fly. Is part of that search for freedom, I get the sense that part of it is tied up in your black heritage, but part of it must have been a very, very adventurous young woman whose spirit just wasn't going to be kept in one place on a farming community in Texas for very long.
That's true. For example, my mother always wanted me to get married. You know how mothers are. Mm-hmm. And I did actually get married. I never lived with a man. And actually, most of my nieces and nephews never knew that I was married. And it's rumored I was married a second time, but we'll see if that's ever confirmed. I dated a lot of men. For example, Prince Kojo out of Africa. But I wanted to go back to my flying. I wanted to make a difference. And I felt that if I could achieve the least of my dreams, then I would be satisfied. So I was always striving. I was not going to sit around waiting for anyone else to come up and just hand it to me.
How did you get started after you finished your flight training in Paris? You told us that your mother did not have any money. You lived for a while with your brother in Chicago and worked as a manicurist. It must have been difficult for you just to find the money to get to Paris. After getting through with your flight school there, how did you ever find the money? Did you own your own planes?
No, I did not. What happened when I came back, I did the speaking in New York City and up and down the eastern seaboard. Then I went back to Chicago.
Those were paid appearances, by the way?
Yes, they were. They were. When I went back to Chicago, Robert Abbott started running articles about me in the Chicago Defender and started basically funding me. At one point, 1923, I went to California. Coast Rubber and Tire Company, which you all know today as Firestone, actually bought me my first Jenny for $400. Now that was unfortunate because my first show down in Los Angeles, 10,000 people waiting for me. And I took off from the same field that Amelia Earhart had taken off from, and at 300 feet, the engine died. And so I crashed. And I broke 3 ribs, and I broke my leg in 2 places. And I was never able to get another sponsor to actually buy me a plane until 1926. And then it was Edward Beeman, who was the heir of Beeman Chewing Gum. So it would just basically, I'd have to go around and talk to people and drum up support and get their financial backing. A lot of my contemporaries were very, very angry with me for accepting money from white men. And I said, well, do you have the money to give to me? And they would say no. And I'm like, well, then this is the only way I can achieve my dream.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you the question I've asked everyone on this program that's come to visit us in the year 2000 from the past. Each of you that we've had on the program has achieved remarkable things in history, and you've broken barriers, and you've shown courage, you've shown absolute, total commitment. And in each case, we've learned why they did it. What was there in your background? What gave you the kind of courage and commitment and dedication that we who, in the population in general, don't do in a lifetime? I'm just so curious about people who have achieved so much and have been recorded in history for their courage and their commitment. Where did it come from?
I would say it, and this is going to sound maybe slightly bitter, but I don't mean it in that manner. Picking cotton. I did not want to do that the rest of my life. I watched my mother being a professional laundress. She was independent, and she didn't rely on anyone else after my father left. And so that was instilled in me to be very independent and to follow my dream, is that if you really, really try, you can achieve anything. And that is what I would always tell the students when I went on my professional talks, is that if I can do it, anyone can. And that's what really drove me. And when I would read about Raymond Delaroche and I would watch the planes fly, and I'm like, that is what I really want to do. And to see that other women had achieved that and other people of color had achieved that, that convinced me that I could do it. And so I did.
I believe I'm correct to say, as I go back, that every person we've had on the program has had someone in their life, usually in the family. Most of them have said a mother or a father instilled in them commitment, dedication, and above all, you can do these things and accomplish your dreams. So I hear that partially in your comments. Your mother was a great strength to you, I understand.
Yes, she was. She was very, very supportive. And even though she might have disagreed with some of my decisions, she never stood in my way. And she would always help me. And that was a great comfort. Also my sisters. My sister Eloise, I typically had to take care of them when my mother was working and get them to and from school. And they were very, very supportive. And also my brothers. Even though my brothers were supportive in the typical way older brothers are, by teasing me, of telling me that I could never do what French women did. They would tell me about the freedoms French women had because they had seen this during World War I. And they're like, well, French women fly, you'll never do that. And of course, I had to set out to prove them wrong.
That might explain one of the reasons why you went to France also.
Yes, it does.
That's very revealing. There's some other questions, but I do not want the program to end without our viewers who are not familiar with your remarkable life knowing that as they heard the introduction that you lived from 1892 to 1926, that you died at a very young age, 34 years old, and that was by the fact that your flying ended in tragedy. Would you share with us how that happened?
Yes. Towards the end, I was still giving talks. I had moved down into Florida. On April 27th, I was down in Jacksonville, had gone out to dinner with some friends, ran into Robert Abbott, whom I had not seen in several years. And I hugged him, and I told everyone, you know, this is the man that I owe my success to. He's the one who got me on the road. He's the one who sponsored me. And he saw William Wills, who had just flown over the plane that Edward Beeman had just paid for. And he took one look at William Wills and said, you know, I do not trust that Texan. And I just poo-pooed him and said, don't worry about it. I was scheduled on May 1st, and it's ironic that today is May Day in your era, to do a show in Jacksonville for a black celebration of May Day. On April 30th, we got up at about 6:30 in the morning to do a run of the field and to look at what my whole piloting would be. Again, I was only 5'4", so I was looking out over the edge of the plane. I didn't have my seatbelt on. And for some reason, the plane jumped from 80 knots up to 110 knots, and it flipped. And at that point, I fell to my death.
Was that on April 30th?
That was on April 30th.
And you were going to perform on May 1st.
I was going to perform on May 1st, so we were just doing our typical run-through of where I would want him to, for example, bank and turn, etc.
And this program is being taped on May the 1st, 2000, but it's going to air later this summer, so our viewers need to know that. I'm going to have you to break character at this point, and the panel may want to ask something too, but I want to introduce Amelia Phillips, who is a member of the faculty at Spokane Falls Community College, used to teach at North Idaho College. Amelia is a great friend of ours, and Amelia, thank you every year on our series, what we call the Popcorn Forum. You do a character, and you're always so excellent, and so it make it look so much like you are that individual, and we appreciate that. May I ask one question? Now that you've done characters several years, what has it meant to you as a person to, for many months, getting ready for this, almost living in the thinking processes of that individual?
It's very interesting, especially since the last two characters that I've done have both been black women of the early 20th century. It's made me really look into what has happened to black Americans in this country. and I have just been fascinated at some of the things that I've discovered. To find out that Bessie Coleman and Josephine Baker hung out with Al Capone. It's just amazing, and that Al Capone actually funded a lot of the soup kitchens and whatnot in the black areas of town, that he was a very different character than what is portrayed in the books. It has also made me wonder how many other characters out there we don't know about or who are not really presented well in the history books. So it's helped me personally just sort of grow, and you're always reciting things and you're always talking about it.
Is that one of the contributions of this format, where we do what we call the Chautauqua performances in format, where you help bring to life people who've been partially, and in some cases, completely forgotten?
Definitely, definitely. I think most of the characters that I have done have been forgotten by history.
Why do students in particular, but the general population, why do they like this format so much? They really, here this year we broke all attendance records. In 6 days we had 5,955 people in attendance. What does the audience get from this that's different from, say, a straight lecture?
Straight lectures are boring. This falls under the realm of a new term called edutainment, where when you think about it, we've always told people that they learn better when they're laughing. You'll retain something when you're laughing and you're relaxing, you're having a good time. And something like this, people are going to pay attention to, because it really brings it out in a very different manner than, yeah, she was born this date, she did this, this, and this, instead of bringing the person to life.
And the costumes and all add to that.
Definitely.
Individuals in their critiquing say that they feel like they've really gone back in history and met that individual. On that note, I had to bring the program to conclusion. I thought I'd have more time for the panel, but we do not. I want to thank Amelia Phillips for portraying on our program Bessie Coleman. It's been a delight having you here, and thank you for journeying through America's 20th century with us. Ladies and gentlemen, with this program we bring to conclusion that special series that we've titled Journey Through 20th Century America. I hope that you've enjoyed this series as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. It's been a delight having these people here from around the United States and also in our own locality. They become very, very good at portraying famous people in history. We hope that's assisted you in learning. We catalog all these programs in our library at North College, which are available for viewing for those who have missed some of the programs. I hope that you will take advantage of what we have for you. We will discuss another subject next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.